how have I organized this seminar talk into 4 parts? I'll start with some motivation, then I will explain the contexts, I will go into the analytical research, and then finalize with some conclusion remarks. So to start with, what brought me here? For many years I've studied the Portuguese city in Northern Africa, which is now Morocco. And I was looking for the clash of urban models that occurred in the 15th and 16th centuries back then. And I arrived to the conclusion that that encounter between an occupying European power, the Portuguese, over-consolidated Muslim Medinas, Muslim cities, occurred through a military operation of reduction of area and perimeter for sustainability purposes. For instance, in this case, which is just one among others, the Muslim city would be something like this, and the Portuguese would just come and cut it and preserve the part that was, of course, closest to the harbor, closest to the connection with the metropolis. So all these strongholds that we see here along the coast were seized to the traditional inland capitals of Fez and Marrakesh. These were to suffer also a colonial input during the first half of the 20th century, during the French protectorship. And like the Portuguese experience, old cities were not touched, and new towns called villes nouvelles were built outside them, their walls. So here we have the 2 old cities of Fez, Fez Al Balif Al Jadida, and then Ville Nouvelle, the French city, completely outside. But these old cities were the models to understand the smaller ones. The same could be observed in Tetuan for the north during the Spanish protectorship, capital of Tetuan, where both cities, the traditional one and the Spanish one, was juxtaposed just through the wall, you see, the traditional city and the Spanish city. So my quest for the understanding of the traditional Maghribi Arab city began here. And so the journey I invite you to tonight, starts in the Maghrib, the west of the East, and goes towards the Eastern Mediterranean, towards the so-called Orient. Opium, submission, kismet, lattice work, caravanserais, fountains, a sultan dancing on a silver tray, Maharaja, Raja, 1,000-year-old Shah, waving from minarets, clocks made of mother of pearls, women with henna-stained noses working their looms with their feet, in the wind green turban imams calling people to prayer. This is the Orient the French poet sees. This is the Orient of the books that come out of the press at the rate of 1 million a minute. But yesterday, today, or tomorrow, an Orient like this never existed and never will. Like the Turkish poets, may those who search for the exotic be deceived. For this seminar, we'll rely on the extraordinary photographic corpus of the CCA collection and look for the photographers and photographs of the time of Pierre Loti and propose an alternative reading rather than the usual orientalistic statements. Our trip will take us through a body of photos represented in the map, and as any traveler is expected to report on his or her journey, our narrative looked for 19th century early photography of Arab cities in the CCA collection, challenging its traditional reception as Oriental and reframing how these photographs can be perceived within a broader Islamic Mediterranean urban concept. Overall, 30 photographers represented at the CCA collection saw their photos scrutinized in order to select the ones whose lens has focused on urban and architectural features rather than anthropological gaze. Photographers, shown here alphabetically, are mainly European, where their origins and sometimes upbringing indicated with a yellow dot. Red dots show their traveling in the Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean or Northern Africa, and black dots and dates represent the survey conducted for this research, meaning photos of Arab Islamic cities at the CCA collection. Whenever a dot is doubled, it means that the photographer had held a studio in that city. Indeed, commercial photographers are just one of the groups of enthusiasts that decided to take advantage of the fashionable Orient at the time, and shops began to appear. Cairo and Alexandria became the trade center at first, then Beirut, then Jerusalem, though very few Muslim-owned studios. Political changes in European countries caused a certain unease among the aristocracy and the upper class, to which most of the early traveler photographers belonged to. Escape from pressures of daily reality, seek refuge in new and different vistas and interests, was a major reason for the massive flow to the east. Regular steamer line from Marseille to Alexandria was established in 1837, and so a large number of travelers were beginning to cross the Mediterranean. Organized tours and packages in the region, like Thomas Cook from the mid-1800s, and it was a fashionable thing to do. There were different groups of photographers. We had amateur photographers, usually tourists on pleasure trips. We had artists, mainly writers and painters. We had pilgrims, including missionaries and ecclesiastics visiting the area. And we had exploration parties going on scientific expeditions or military expeditions. This rush towards the Orient coincided with the invention of photography. So history of photography and the Middle East are very intertwined. During the early decades of photography, no other area of the world, except in Europe, was so thoroughly photographed as well as the Middle East. So, the earliest photographic processes were employed in the Middle East almost immediately after they were developed in Europe. Some of the first books to be illustrated with original photographs dealt with regions in the area, and the first application of photography as a documentary tool of scientific exploration took place here, when hieroglyphs on Egyptian temples were recorded. After the official invention of photography in 1839 through daguerreotype, which was a positive medium, a Paris optician and publisher dispatched a group to Egypt and Palestine. It was called Excursion daguerréenne, vues et monuments les plus remarquables du globe en 1841 et 1844. Another process was meanwhile perfected. It was the calotype in 1851, which used paper negative. And it was followed by the collodion process, using glass negatives. It is not object of this seminar and talk to analyze deeply technical details relating to the photograph, nor the photographer's biographies in detail. However, we have indicated each one's just the main publications and exhibitions of photos regarding the CCA collection, of course, back in Europe, to have an idea of the dissemination of knowledge those particular photos of urban spaces and buildings might have received. All the evidence regarding the challenge of looking at Islamic city was there, already available in the second half of the 19th century. And see, okay. First photographer to use the calotype in the Middle East was Maxime du Qu'on, still in the 1840s. And his illustrated publications were a stunning success. 19th century travelers described the process of collecting as enchanting work. Du Qu'on described his role as collector, feverish in his mission. Palm trees, deserts, ruined temples. But when turning to cities, its depictions enhanced the chaos, the disorder, the insalubrity of living conditions. Other calotypists followed, like Auguste Salzman in Jerusalem, for example. And also Louis de Clercq with a French financed archaeological expedition in 1859. As we can see, first it was just the domain of the French photographers. The British came in later with a serious sense of mission, following the fact-gathering, documentary style, avoiding personal interpretation of scenes and landscapes. English photographers were either surveyors, tourists, even pilgrims, or commercial photographers such as this one in the picture, Francis Frith, and also Frank Mason Good. It seems their objective was sometimes focused on the ruined state of the visited cities. that were in continuity with the ruins of the past. The Western image of the Middle East was restricted almost exclusively to the fallen grandeur of its past civilizations, its biblical antiquities and associations, and they were picturesque or illustrative as how things must have been 2,000 years or more before. Most resident photographers remained on the East their entire lives, such as Hammerschmidt in the picture, or also Béchard and Bonfils, and tourism made it a profitable business. The remarks of Adrien Bonfils, son of this one, Félix Bonfils, and continuing the Bonfils Photo Studio House, typify the thoughts and aims of many photographers who worked in the Middle East during the 19th century. He said, "Costumes, types, customs, everything seems fixed in this immutable Orient. Civilization, penetrating everywhere, will finish by taking away from this country. Before that happens, before progress has completely done its destructive job, before this present, which is still the past, has forever disappeared, we have tried to fix and immortalize it in a series of photographic views we are offering to our readers in this album." Nevertheless, the touristic pressure and consumption refrained, delayed, and even stopped the real perception of the Orient and of the characteristics of the Arabic Islamic city in this case. It was much more interesting to keep with the legendary image of the regions, its monuments, and its social habits. Context is, as with any historical source, crucial to the interpretation of these photographs. Not necessarily always definitive, but certainly provocative and suggestive. I'm going back. Context is, as with any historical source, crucial to this interpretation of these photographs. Not necessarily always definitive, but certainly provocative and suggestive, as Elizabeth Edwards puts it in Anthropology and Photography. The cultural circumscriptions included under the modern interpretive blanket Western perception of the other are central to the creation and consumption of photography in the second half of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. Going to the Orient was going towards the remains and ghosts of our own history. The trip to the Orient was also, at least for the knowledgeable and educated traveler, a sort of pilgrimage to the origins. In the beginning, photographers privileged landscapes and monuments, and only afterwards will they detain themselves at people. Technical constraints, which implied long times of exposures, were one of the causes. The first collodion photograph was taken in Palestine, and you see it here in the upper picture in 1856. Yet, the first paradox of the Oriental photograph was there, its monochrome, when compared to the colorful textures of painting. The vision was less romantic than painting, where nor the dramas nor the massacres of literature and music. Let's take opera as example. During the 19th century, the musical taste reflected the time. Big epical productions relating to Near Eastern ancient civilizations, such as Nabucodonosor or Aida, engaged romances and schemes between West and East, such as L'Italiana in Algeri, and reversibly immediately Il Turco in Italia, mastered by Rossini, just to give a small example. The Oriental plot picked up biblical stories such as Salome and moved further east to the Indian subcontinent and the Far East, with Bizet and Puccini writing operas on distant temples and empires and encounters well into the 20th century. Prejudices and preconceptions of the photographers, most of whom were foreign-born, were mirrored in images made during that time. Edward Said, in his seminal book titled Orientalism, characterized the pervasive forces conditioning Occidental thought about the Orient as so authoritative that no one writing, thinking, or acting on the Orient could do so without taking into account the limitations on thought and action imposed by Orientalism. end of quote. So we can say that Orientalism could be seen as the gate of Romanticism focused on the Orient. Carefully staged photos served to reinforce the impressions brought back to the West by such early travelers, most of them venturing in the fashionable grand tour that would lead them to the ruins of classical Greece, the exoticism of former Constantinople, the religious monuments of Palestine, and the stones of ancient Egyptian civilization. Gustave Flaubert defined what an Orientalist was back then. Un Orientaliste est un homme qui a beaucoup voyagé. Voilà. And in fact, it's probably what this guy is. You know, aided by a lot of Oriental, he tries to win over the pyramids and gain again the former ancient civilization. The extensive photographic activity was, in fact and indeed, an act of aggression, if not a physical occupation, a spiritual appropriation of those lands. Photography was in many ways symbolic of a unique and equal relationship. It represented technological superiority, harnessed control of the physical world. Non-European races who appeared less accomplished technologically were interpreted as representing the childhood of mankind. In the case of Middle East, as the cradle of the civilizational standards that long had left the region and of which only Europeans were now detainers. Appropriation of most of the non-European globe and structuring responses to it was a set of assumptions concerning superiority of the white man and the duties and rights that this superiority bestowed. There was an increasing dominance of ideas which placed value on technological and scientific achievements, of which the digging of the Suez Canal in 1869 is just the epitome. The second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century saw major colonial expansion and consolidation of European powers. The context in which photography must be understood and perceived is not only a cultural one, but also, and very importantly, a political one. This perception of the other, most powerfully manifested in theories of the race, is completely intertwined with the expansion and maintenance of European colonial power. After the misfortune Napoleonic campaign in Egypt at the turn of the 1700s to the 1800s, from early to mid-19th century, the military option was replaced by a cultural and economic colonization of the Orient, also a direct result of Western imperialists and expansionist attitudes. France and England each strove to expand its political influence in the East. Colonial aesthetics could never be divorced from the utilitarian impulses and appropriations of colonial rule. The picturesque, exotic, and unchanging image which was portrayed of the Middle East was an illusion, but it was this illusion which the vast majority of commercial photographers sought to capture and market in the West to a public which revealed in the romantic look of the Orient. Michel de Montaigne said in his essay of Cannibals in 1958, "The history of European view of non-European peoples has always reflected European history imagining themselves. In this case, of its picturing as so technologically and intellectually superior and developed that they could dispose the other in fairs and expositions, such as these cases of a stage street scene of Cairo, so-called, or a decorative plaster embroidery window detail in another wall fair. What does it matter if the colonized Orient gives more than a glimpse of the other side of its scenery, as long as the phantom of the Harem persists, especially since it has become profitable?" Hermé Désiré tried to depict Cairo as an European capital, looking to the traditional city from the western gardens of the European quarters. But blockage forces were powerful to prevent any effort of understanding the Arab-Islamic urbanism from succeeding. If not, let's hear the words by Lord Cromer, who was a proconsul in Egypt between the 19th and the 20th century. He said, The mind of the Oriental, on the other hand, like his picturesque streets, is eminently wanting in symmetry. Although the ancient Arabs acquired in a somewhat higher degree the science of dialectics, their descendants are singularly deficient in the logical faculty. End of quote. The Oriental photography exposes itself as a factory of stereotypes, copying and pasting cliches with racist, even sexist connotations. Nevertheless, it relies on a body of recopied images sold to travelers, sometimes as postcards, that hides a richer and more complex reality of no less important images yet preserved in a much scarcer number. In fact, the rivalry between France and England created a demand for increased info. In our scrutiny here, we'll search among the side photos. The analytical corpus that was already available in the second half of the 19th century to photographers, to the public, but also to archaeologists and art historians. What I propose now is a cut from the CCA collection looking for that evidence. Many insights and perspectives have been focusing on the scientific relevance of early architectural photography for the study of ancient Egypt or religious buildings in the Holy Land, but little has been said about its pertinence for urban studies of cities in the Northern Africa, Middle East axis. Yet photography allowed for the recognition of notions, models, and concepts other than the known and accepted ones in the Western world. So instead of looking as what Roland Barthes has defined in his Camera Lucida as the studium, or a kind of general enthusiastic commitment, but without special equity, one shall look for that second element which will disturb the studium, the flash, the detail that will prick us as observers, and that is the punctum. I have organized the analytical research in 4 criteria, according to the scope of selected photos. So here in this chart, you can see they're organized by chronologically. So already from starting in the 40s, but mainly in the 50s and the 60s and so on, we see the amount of photographers represented at the CCA collection, and also the dissemination of that information in Europe through exhibitions and publications also. But I'll propose another cut, and I will see them through high panoramic views, low generic views, street views, domesticity, and religious buildings. Taking inspiration in this drawing, elaborated after one of the first daguerreotypes by Pierre-Gustave Joly-Lotbinière, the adopted Québécois who acquired one of the first daguerreotype cameras and was a pioneer in its use. I thought it was appropriate to bring in a local, of course. Let's start by a selection of high panoramic views, following again Roland Barthes, this time in Le Message photographique. Qu'est-ce qu'on a fait comme panorama? Une image qu'on cherche à déchiffrer, où l'on essaie de reconnaître des lieux connus, d'identifier des repères. For each map, the CCA collection sample for analysis is indicated as in the picture. In fact, urban landscape became a photographic subject as early as 1840s. So, learning from these images, we can immediately extract notions of density. The density of traditional Islamic fabrics is not just a matter of spatial compression, but an expression of the tightly woven social network. And from here we extract the concept of Medina as city or urban assemblage. A city that is clearly separated from the military and administrative sector, the citadel, the castle, or Burj, Ksar, or even Kasbah. A city that behaves itself not only as a compact organism, but also as a closed one through its walls. The wall is the limit also for spreading outskirts neighborhood called Rabat, the third sector of the city besides the Medina and the citadel. Outside is where cemeteries called Maqbara are also placed, in a clear reference to the consistent zoning of the Islamic urban display. Cityscapes allows us to see minarets raising from an apparently disorganized fabric. In fact, what they indicate are different residential areas on compact neighborhoods gathered around one mosque with their own services. These parcels of land or city quarters were known as Homa, Mahala, or even Khita. And so here, for instance, in this cityscape of Latake, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 minarets, and each one relates, of course, to a kind of neighborhood that is organized around them. The cultural matrix of Islam, which favors enclosed spaces, doesn't allow too many open spaces in the city. Actually, the courtyards of mosques are the semi-public squares the city doesn't possess. And you can see here how a perfect geometry imposes itself for the enclosed space against what's more like an organic exterior. Next to the main mosques is the place where the commercial program of the city wants to be, in open markets called souk, or covered markets called kisaria. From these aerial panoramas, one can perceive that the imbricate domestic space is just the post, sharing communal walls. The residential unit is the courtyard house. It is to the domestic courtyard that the facades are turned to, not to the streets. The interior display of architectural beauty prevails. The D1 looks over a haven. The D1 is this space over here, which is the main room of that courtyard, and actually is also always placed in the southern wall of this courtyard, which in the northern hemisphere means it's always under shadow, of course. And this D1 looks over a haven where water and sometimes vegetation punctuate the space. But even in residential courtyards, the two important poles of Islamic culture, the halal, what is public, allowed, profane, is separated from the haram, the private, the forbidden, or the sacred, through mashrabiyya, for instance, an apparatus later taken from Iberia also to the Americas, by the way. Lowering our viewpoint from aerial to more profile views of the city, the same or other notions can be discussed. The homogeneous skyline of the city is only interrupted by minarets. In smaller cities or villages, there is just one congregational mosque, not several, just such as in Cairo or Latakia or Tripoli. Indeed, the Phaetic skyline of minarets and domes was a privileged set for early photographers. But yet again, the functional separation within the city is confirmed. Cemetery and proto-industrial activities are placed outside the walls. Those photographs show perfectly the defensive system as a border between inner and outer spaces, between citizens and foreigners or visitors. In smaller villages, the encircling walls of houses form the fortified belt themselves. So here it's just a village, so we don't really have a fortress-like wall like this one, a sur. A bell that is only trespassed through distinctively marked gates called bab, the only permeabilities in the traditional Islamic city. So let us walk through them and discover the urban tissue through street views. Next to gates, of course, leading to mosques, one can witness again the strategic positioning of markets, which are called souk. Streets deliberately avoid long perspectives as a way to defend against the outsider enemy and insider curious. Those traditional Islamic cities were built for human-scale pedestrian movements. Hanging over streets, a lot of consoles can be seen. You can see here, 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 etc. In fact, this aspect derives from the concept of fina, which is an exterior space immediately adjacent to the exterior wall of a house and allocated for the daily temporary use of the inhabitants of the house for the loading and unloading of business burden and the temporary parking of such animals. So this space that we can see here on the ground has rights to the owner of the house. Or the concept of fina on the ground extends vertically and is also reflected in the air. Projections from houses towards the street were allowed, provided they did not obstruct passage. So that's why we see all these invasions towards the streets. And air rights structures are also very frequent. This concept is related to the idea of utilizing the airspace of the fina on both sides of the street, the concept of sabbat. Building a room over a street joining two structures owned by the same person was also allowed. What appears erratic is in fact ruled, contrasting the exotic ambience that some photographers searched for. But the camel that you see here in this image, with its size and capabilities, was actually determinant for street patterns. So a height clearance for a sabbat over a street is also governed by minimum dimensions. Other photos show rectilinear streets after all, such as in the old town of Damascus. This is in fact a public through street, a shard, relying on the classical legacy of the previous Hellenistic Roman city classical plan. And this was another evidence that early photography depicted regarding the differences between cities such as Damascus or Cairo, that the Oriental eye refused to acknowledge, homogenizing evolutionary or founded urban models in just altogether. Recent studies have shown the Islamization process of classical Damascus, making it clear that for Islamic law there is a difference between the true streets, open in both extremities, like this major thoroughfare that you see here, for instance, streets or public paths through which all men should be able to walk, as said by the prophets, from the dead-end streets, the cul-de-sac called derb. And this map here below shows all the urban areas that are exclusively accessed by derbs, and they are therefore semi-private. So it means all these parts indicated in this map show all the spaces of the city that are only accessed by dead-end streets. So you don't need to pass there unless you live there or you have something to do there. And actually, it's very interesting sometimes to determine these spaces in a city that we don't know or we visit for the first time through children that are always eager to try our cameras and stuff and have a conversation. At a certain point, they will stop, and we don't understand really why they have stopped in that crossroads and not in the next one. Why won't they chase us another few meters? Because they know that these are the limits of the semi-private neighborhood or quarter which their mothers allow them to play with, which are more or less familiar to them, of course, and don't venture into a major thoroughfare. So I've been relying a lot on kids for some research today. So the city has different levels, layers and filters between the public and the private, between the halal and the haram. For its religious and social ideal, Islam needed 4 types of structures: mosques for prayers, markets for houses that we all have seen so far. But early photographers have never ventured inside hammams or bathhouses used for hygiene, whereas Orientalistic painters and writers have dreamed of that, of course. Maybe it is time to finish this analytical approach, looking to the most photographed items, religious buildings. Starting with the mosque and its characterization as masjid, or as a more important one, such as the Jami Masjid, Friday Mosque. These mosques usually gather around an open courtyard, as seen before, called sahm, where the ablutions rituals would take place. Stepping inside the prayer hall, usually a hypostyle room, oriented towards Mecca by a wall named Qibla, marked by a niche called mihrab, next to which the imam can preach on top of the minbar, and sometimes an elevated structure for elites praying, the maksura, is displayed as well. You can see them all here. The Qibla wall, the mihrab niche, the minbar, and the maksura. The main exterior feature of a mosque is its minarets. And as diverse as Islamic city can present itself, also different models apply to this structure. Another important equipment of the city is the Quranic school, the madrasa, many times next to mosques and representing the different philosophical Islamic schools. Not that it needed a proper space to exist, a notion appropriated by the Western to, once again, testify the inability of the autochthonous to sovereign themselves. Tombs are much more widely photographed. The mausoleum of a saint is often inscribed within a larger complex that includes a mosque. Photographers became obsessed by the quantity, magnificence, and ruin of tombs outside the walls of Cairo. What interpretations did miss then was that these tombs for sultans were built on the outgoing path of the city towards Mecca, now the northern and southern cemeteries. Cairo has a long story, started here in Al Fustat and going back into 4 different phases of city, to Al-Qahira, which is now called Islamic Cairo, and the 2 main cemeteries, the northern cemetery and the southern cemetery, this east, and this is the citadel, are on the direction of the path of the way out of the city towards Mecca. Of course, that was the place to be buried, of course. So again, they were insisting, these Orientalists, in a vision of a dead city, of a city of the dead, as these neighborhoods are still known these days, for they house more, now, millions of people. Okay, wrapping up. The 19th century had started with one of the most positive consequences of a failed military campaign. The Description de l'Égypte, published between 1809 and 1828, as a result of the scholars who had joined the Napoleonic army, constitutes the basis for all Orientalist studies later conducted. It was the starting point for the modern urban recognition of the Islamic city, because besides surveys of buildings, topographical surveys of Cairo and other cities in Egypt, for example, were executed as well. Yet this urban and archaeological knowledge of the cities was subordinated to the cultural domination of the binomium, imperialism and exoticism, that have in common the profound comprehension of history and cultural relations. Then Orientalist tropes that came to coalesce around the notion of the Islamic city well into the 20th century were based on a static and changing type of city. The Islamic city was a negative construction born of the projection of the otherness. What was not Western, the modern, the capitalists. And this mental construction blocked the assimilation of a process matured for over a millennium, ending with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1918. Uniform legislative guidelines, an almost identical social-cultural framework created by Islam, and similarity of climate conditions and construction techniques within most of the Islamic world helped produce remarkable similarities in approach to the city-building process. This resulted in the frequent occurrence of the familiar urban pattern throughout this vast geographic area, though deviations did occur, of course. The Islamic city must be understood not in physical sense, but rather in a purely cultural and social context. Interdependence, I cannot say it quickly. Oh, that's so much. Interdependence between the members of the community was strong enough to coordinate individual decisions in a natural and flexible way, thus producing an organic whole out of a sum of individual acts of building. There was no formal scheme which would give in advance a rigid global of forthcoming developments, and no need for explicit building codes. Planning was limited to a mere regulating and adjusting process in order to prevent possible individual infringements on the right of neighbors and on the interest of the community. Orientalists were also very negative in these points, claiming little administration in the Muslim city, denying the existence of communities, tawarif, of institutions such as the waqf or humus, depending on the region where we are, which detain a large portions of the city for communal purposes. Denied the existence of agents like the muhtasib, which coordinates all the legal matters in the markets, or the qadi, which regulates and mediates all the neighborly conflict that may exist. Moreover, within the process of building an urban development, the roots of the structure and the unity prevalent in the vast Islamic world are the product of the fiqh, the Islamic jurisprudence, the mechanism interpreting and applying the value system of Sharia, the Islamic divine law, which derives from the Holy Quran and the Sunnah. Hence, all the cities inhabited predominantly by Muslims share an Islamic identity, which is directly due to the application of Sharia values in the process of city building. When one inquires to a corpus of large Arab cities situated from Morocco to Iraq, from Syria to Yemen, virtually Ottoman domination for all, even though the Ottomans didn't really impose their culture or their language, the major features of urban structure appear fairly constant and exhibit a rationale such that we are justified in speaking of a coherent urban system that still relates to the medieval world that we try to systematize with some examples here. And 19th century photography may well depict that portrait. At the turning point of independence emancipations, Brunswick's seminal article, Urbanisme médiéval et droit musulman, in 1947, was still Orientalist in the way it defined the urban form of Islamic cities as irrational, without any plan, as a consequence of the spontaneous and administrative organization of the Islamic society. Still Orientalist may be the work of Saint-Sauvager on the classical legacy of Syrian cities be considered, as seen before. Nevertheless, they represented a starting point for modern studies on the Islamic city. Works of revision on the Orientalist approach emerged through the holding of conferences and scholarly meetings that brought together academics from different backgrounds, including from Arab and Turkish countries. First, the colloquium in Oxford in 1965, published in 1970 by Hourani and Stern, taking a vernacular regionalist standpoint, followed by the one organized by Robert Sargent in 1980, both were called the Islamic City, or the symposium held in Medina, in Saudi Arabia, called the Arab City, its character and Islamic cultural heritage in 1982, very well participated. Until we arrived at the book by the Sim Salim Hakim in 1986, titled Arabic Islamic Cities, Building and Planning Principles, who established groundbreaking systematization of the knowledge so far, seeking the derivation of the urban structure of cities in Islamic law. Together with André Raymond's prior 1984 publication, Arab Cities in the Ottoman Empire, they represented a cornerstone of Arab urban studies on the subject. More recently, regional approaches began to tell the differences within the general abstraction. Paolo Cuneo's book Storia dell'Urbanistica e il Mondo Islamico in 1986, represents the most systematic work on the history of cities and different regions of the Muslim world. 1 year before, Torres Balbás had indicated the way, aiming at just one region in Ciudades Hispano-Musulmanas, using archaeology as a source too. More recently, other scholars such as Stefano Bianchi in 2000 with Urban Form in the Arab World, Past and Present, are concerned with the urban renewal of Islamic cities, also adopting a social-religious standpoint on the Middle Eastern city. Or Hisham Mortada in 2003 with traditional Islamic principles of built environment, going back to the question of Middle Eastern or Arab cities as direct translations of Islamic codes and laws into physical form, and excluding all other aspects of the formation of cities. Too bad. Or even Attilio Petruccioli at his 2007 book After Amnesia, Learning from the Islamic Mediterranean Urban Fabric, proposing a reading using epistemological tools developed in the field of morphological and typological studies. The following couple of years saw the apparition of conferences proceedings again, the city in the Islamic world and the Mediterranean Medina, which tried to update the state of the art. Terminology has always been one of the most challenging aspects of the concept and body of scholarship gathered. Yet, problematic terminological distinctions should always be contingent upon contexts. Shall we talk about Islamic city or cities in Dar al-Islam? Sometimes we can use Middle Eastern cities with a more, geographical perspective and emphasis, or Islamic or Muslim cities with social and religious interests, or Arab cities underlying cultural specific aspects, such just like we use for this research and presentation, due to the geographical coverage involved. Not going into other systems such as the Balko-Anatolian, the Irano-Afghan, the Mogul, and so on. Other terminologies have been tried with less success, such as Islamicized or even Islamicates. Concepts evolve as we speak. Notions on contemporary concepts of Islamic, Arab, or Middle Eastern cities are dissolving in transversal process of modernization. Middle Eastern cities can no longer be isolated from the main forces shaping contemporary cities. That is reflection for another talk. For now and here, we wanted to demonstrate how a series of architectural urban images could have also provided material for cultural scrutiny, and show the validity of the scientific value and exploration of such photos for the purpose of the traditional Arab-Muslim Medina study too. A hidden knowledge that was already available at the time photographs were being produced, yet comments made by reviewers or press of the photographic exhibitions back then mainly dealt with the quality of the images. On the one hand, and at a certain level, photography stopped the Orientalist depiction that literature and painting allowed with no limits. However, on the other hand, both massive tourism and geostrategical political gains controlled the information and the image of the Oriental city to be preserved. Early photography seems to have never participated as a tool of critical revision at studies produced in the field of architecture or urbanism more recently. The Western look on early photography has for long been devoted to the descriptive interpretations and not to morphological analysis. Many times painting, engravings, literature, surveys are evoked and examined for that purpose, but rarely pioneer snapshots. We wish this seminar has contributed to perceive differently these images through a cut made at the CCA collection, thanking again the CCA for this research journey and adventure. Thank you very much.
This was more than one, many journeys, not only one, many at the same time. And in fact, it opened up a field that I've been thinking a lot. Now, you see, Orientalism always comes with painting, poems, and so on. Looking at this, what you simply call it analytical approach. I think that there is much more than just an analytical approach in the journey you present. But it's a different way of looking, through the medium of photography, a well-known concept in the Oriental.
There's definitely a methodological question here, but what I was always very struck is that when we read and study the cities and what scholars have been produced, they never rely on early photography to study the cities. Why? It's very rare. They illustrate them. They rely on photography that is executed now. They rely on surveys and descriptions, written descriptions back then. Why not? Many are staged, but in each photography, even if it is staged, it can never lie about what it is staged, what it depicts, what can be perhaps behind the Oriental girl or behind the Oriental donkey, etc. I don't know.
Question, come, please.
Yes. You know, when I walk in, I'm from Galapagos area, and when I walk in the old city, I see when I visit these old houses, you know, the Arab houses, I see like this incredible attention and care about the details and the temperature, the light, all these things, you know. And I feel the Arab architecture has declined so much in recent years. And I wonder what's the reason. Even like the way the streets are formed, you know, like in a zigzag, on a curvy line, you know, it's very comfortable to walk in. Even like you don't feel the sun that much, you know. Even the light is steady in the streets. And the modern day is just completely complete failure, you know. Like, what's the reason for that? You know?
That's a big question. I'm not sure I'm going to answer exactly, because if I answer, I'm probably going to agree, and I'm not going to do that.
And how is it possible to use those?
But I understand. That's what I was here saying, that's subject for another talk, and it's been subject for now many conferences and people studying and working on that field. So, relating to your first part of the question, of course, traditional methods relied on a lot of experience that really perfectioned some kind of habits of inhabiting the household or the streets. Maybe the household, because the street is more, as probably expressed before, related to other kinds of regulation that end up regulating them and end up the streets end up like that. I'm not sure there is a decline. There is a change. And the debate now is that's why I was always very careful talking about traditional city. Because of course after the fallen of the Ottoman Empire and after all the protectorships, can we say that Riyadh is an Islamic city, for instance, or Dubai is an Islamic city? Not really. There are cities of the world. There are cities that are probably inhabited by a lot of Muslims, as there are Muslim communities in many other cities of the world that has nothing, that never have that kind of adjective next to them. So, of course, there are principles that have generated the traditional city that we find comfortable and that we are used to, and especially youth, for instance. Even though Aleppo is also a city that relies on a very classical plan, so it has that kind of those influences, like many other Syrian ones. I think that what we have now on the table sometimes is more than an architectural and urban question, is a social one. Because a social one.
No, it is.
Yeah, because when, for instance, I see in many traditional communities, I wouldn't say Islamic countries, but I see traditional communities largely inhabited by Muslim people, in traditional countries called Islamic countries or Muslim countries or Arab countries for that matter. When I see, for instance, lodging or dwellings, there are similars to the ones I could find in the outskirts of my hometown. I perfectly understand why all the windows are shut, why the balconies are not used, of course, why people try to adapt themselves to a new reality without really having the houses for that. So I think the debate is a little bit larger. It's not exactly that the quality has diminished, but the times have changed, and so alternatives have to be reflected upon the time being. For who are we building for? Where are we building for? The same old questions and basic questions of architecture apply to any case. I don't think there is a decline. What I think is there are not advantages, there are values in the traditional construction and the traditional display that may be observed, as we may observe and should observe all the qualities that we have acquired and learned from history when we design cities or when we plan houses.
Yeah, but there's also tremendous arrogance. I worked in Cairo from 1980 to 1990, I guess, on the restoration of the Benazir synagogue in Old Cairo.
Old Cairo,
And it's surrounded by, basically by Christian and by Christian buildings, basically. And the state of understanding of how the construction, people were recommending, people from England, for example, that you redo the roof with rubber things. I mean, the only way to do it is the traditional way that they built it, because it was so well thought out, and so there is this, and they try to, for example, protect water, because there's a huge problem of water infiltration from the enormous amount of population that induces water from hills into Old Cairo, which is, is a very low space. And they wanted to put heavy cement in there. Well, of course, this stuff's to be ridiculous. So there is a arrogance of we know everything about technology, which has to be really reviewed. Plus the fact that it was impossible to get really people in Cairo to work on old buildings. They didn't know about it anymore. All they wanted to do was melt down what was there, and those wonderful fields where they had the potteries. When I first went to Cairo, they were black, smoke coming out. They didn't want that. It was on the way in from the airport, and so they said, "No, let's get rid of this." How much did they ruin of history and of kind of a sense of place by removing that? So I think there is a problem of how we approach these things with our great sense of being so modern and so smart and so technologically aware. We don't look at what basic ways of dealing with things are. We put air conditioning in everywhere, where they were wonderful, they'd be shrouded, and all those things are wonderful sort of ways of dealing with it. So I would agree with that argument and the problems.
But probably there's both problems. Decline in terms of the way the people look at the city or appreciate, and they have the awareness, and changes. We have seen in those cities, as you say, Riyadh. Is this an Arabic and Islamic? No. Probably it's something you say global.
It does have an old part. I spent 3 years in Riyadh.
Pardon?
I spent 3 years in Riyadh, and I know the old city. It's still preserved, but very rarely people go there. I used to go there. There's at least 2 neighborhoods I'm aware, Dira and Bata. Dira, I went alone because it's where the religious police have their headquarters, so kind of avoid the Western women going there. And also where they do stage the local executions. And Bata is more has lost a little bit its characteristic because now it's mostly inhabited by people that come as guest workers from India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, so it loses its characteristic because of it. Plus, for example, in Riyadh, the first skyscraper, real skyscraper, was built in 2000. They were not authorized, the construction of skyscrapers were not authorized because they didn't like it. Actually, Saudis don't live in skyscrapers, and it's very rare to find somebody. They live in houses where you have walls with 4 or 5 meters high. They like their privacy. Plus, the cities in most of the Middle East have or had one advantage, which is they can grow. They can grow. They don't have limitations in terms of urban planning. It's like this. For example, I'll give you the example of Riyadh. What the government does. The whole land belongs to the royal family. The governor of Riyadh establishes a certain area where there will be urban development. What they do is they construct the roads, they put the power, and then they give a lease of the land for the family to build a house. So you have a city that has probably 3 million inhabitants, and the perimeter of that city is 200 kilometers. It took me 2 hours to go around it, driving at 120. So that's the size of the city. It grows. When I asked him how it is, he said, we have a lot of desert.
I'm sorry, I have to leave. Thank you. I'll get back to you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming. But sorry, go ahead. No, I was saying that that aspect is also a kind of another kind of exportation of the West. So it's like preserving the historical center and then doing whatever it wants around it. As with houses, there's some kind of industrial pressure from the West that builds and roads and houses and equipment and stuff that really some of these countries that of course are very wealthy are very eager of and maybe forgetting some of the principles that would be more beneficial for its own population since they of course live in that kind of society.
Sorry. Thank you for so interesting lecture. At some point you talked about the sheer geometry of the mosques and their courtyards, opposed to the organic development of the Mahala. Of course, I can see the difference and I know what you're talking about. But later you talked also about the roots of the formation of the streets and the city. Kind of an informal legislation of the housing areas of Islamic cities. So I would like, although I don't know much about it, so maybe I'm just making a hypothesis that is not valid. I'd like to ask, isn't the term organic, again under the shadow, let's say, of Orientalism, you know what I mean? Why do we call it?
I was writing that word and I said, I'm going to hear about this, I'm sure. But sincerely, if we unveil all the things that have been written about organism and organic architecture and organic cities, and you just think about organic as an adjective, it really suited my purpose. Of course, when I say that in this image, which is actually the one I used Ibn Tulum in Cairo, for me it's also one of the best examples because the courtyard, the Sahn, is really, really big, and so it really is it's almost like a square in the city. So when I said perfect geometry against the organic, of course the organic means that it's not planned. And it is not planned in the sense of the design process, whereas the mosque is. Okay, and so the mosque is designed. Someone thought about it. Someone thought about the cubits of the sun to be in that square, the position of the ablutions, the orientation. It starts with the orientation. Whereas the street system and display is the result not of a design, a paper plan, but of rules that are applied sometimes case by case, and then the results, whenever it never interferes with my neighbor's rights, can occur. That's why the street can go like this, and then like that, and maybe in a section it can go like this, and like that, if it doesn't, of course, go into my neighbor's rights. So most of the planning of the city is by rules of co-inhabitants than by, of course, design. There are, though, few. For instance, traditionally, a thoroughfare street, a shar, but it's not applied, that's why I didn't mention, had to be 7 cubits, which is around 3.5 meters, which is large for a street. 2 camels can cross, you see. But these are, but again, it's a rule, not and it's a rule that has almost a design process. This is very, this can be here for hours, because thoroughfares mainly result of new establishments. For instance, when a sultan had the opportunity to allocate to some tribes a fixed point for them to establish, then a process called XIXe, that comes from the name XIXe, that was the city quarter that I mentioned when I said XIXe, or the term XIXe means to establish neighborhoods. So when I establish neighborhoods, I have to give them the conditions to work. So maybe I have a separation street between the neighborhoods, and those are the thoroughfares that go to the mosque, around which is the market, and go to the walls, and the walls encircles the city, and so on and so on. And then within a quarter already established, the process is like multiplying. Cairo is a very good example again. The Islamic Cairo that we saw in one of those pictures it was mainly palaces when it was founded in the 11th century, in the 10th, 11th century. And then pressure and other rules, they deviated somehow the citadel, so they didn't inhabit those palaces. So at a certain point there was a XIXe process over the palaces for lodging people to live there. And so when we do that, thoroughfares are not drawn, but are left opened, I would say, and then other concentrations and then densification of other areas occurs, and then with all the processes of the fina, of the sabat, of the things you can say. It's never a plan designed that is accomplished from 0 to 100.
Congratulations for the research. My question is more towards the tool, photography, as a tool to understand the city, as a tool to kind of break down the city. And I wonder if you have because the parallel the contemporary parallel of photography is quite striking. Like today, for instance, the Arab Spring or the city is understood in very different conditions. The role of the image is very different from the 19th century. So I wonder if you have something to say, like how you have mapped the city with photographs of the 19th century in order to build an argument, and how this condition can be translated to today's way in which images are spread and generated and generated with a different speed.
Well, I think that the question doesn't exist these days. Photography for many years has been the right arm of architecture for a long time, not only for representing it, of course, afterwards, and for faking it, as we know, but also as a tool to work. We have relied on visual resources and photography for a long time. What I wanted to show is that that information and through photography and through other means, we can, and those scholars that I mentioned in the end, have come to these conclusions about the Islamic city. But that information, or not all information, but a very important corpus of information was available through photography in the second half of the 19th century. And it wasn't used. And I think I explained why it wasn't used. And I wanted to prove how we can rely on that photos to exactly arrive to the same results that scholars have arrived 100 years later.
More comments?
I would like to make a comment, and then
Why are you sitting? She's not sitting.
just to rub the organic idea and the tool of photography together, and what I think Jorge has done beautifully, that he and I use another text of Roland Barthes that is called the Eiffel Tower, La Tour Eiffel. And with this text, Barthes look from the tower to the city and see the city, the organisms of the city, and then he say the Eiffel Tower, 19th century scientificism, all this idea of science, of structure, and Barthes of course. So this idea of organic, structuralism, and that it was exactly what George has done. He, through the photography, as a panorama, like Barthes has suggested, formulated, he looked to the city in morphologically. So he has done this very, and then I tied your question up because organic is correct concept to be used with what George has done.
I'm tempted to disagree a little bit, at least just to open up a debate about the term organic. I mean, if you understand, for example, the way the term organism was used in early modern philosophy, let's say 1750s, around that time, it was actually used in exactly the opposite meaning, meaning the fact that parts are arranged according to some kind of ultimate purpose. Yeah, which you cannot figure out actually.
Organs.
Exactly. Yeah. So for example, we are organisms because we cannot quite tell the way in which our different parts are put together such that we function in a particular way. In other words, you cannot pinpoint exactly what the purpose is, which you can do in a mechanism like a car, for example, or a watch. Yeah. So the term organism has started being associated to that which has been designed, yeah, with that which has a purpose. Yeah. So it's kind of the opposite of what we mean, assuming that organism or the organicity is the city which has to be designed or planned. So maybe
Do you think it's really the opposite?
No, I mean, I'm just saying that maybe it's worth sort of reconsidering the way in which.
Because in a sense, I don't think that in that concept a model like a design model would be implied. But if we look at the cities and see the levels of rules that eventually decides what the exact design of the city, it's a quite structured and complicated and very firm way of behaving as a city. So in that way, I would say there is a very organic enterprise behind what we would just call organic as chaotic, I would say,
so
labyrinthic.
So you meant So you meant city, you meant design, you meant plan, but in a way that is not perhaps readily apparent, in a way that is, it's rules of design. something that not so on the surface of a Western person would understand.
I hope the presentation has somehow helped to look behind this Oriental veil, to use a contextual expression, and see how the city is determined, even though it is not designed.
If I may add something, because I thought it was a fascinating presentation, and don't get me wrong.
Oh, I don't know.
Come on. We're in a discussion. Exactly. Yeah. The other thing, maybe for future work, I was struck by one of the last statements, no, when you said, well, I have attempted to prove that by using early photography, we could have arrived at the same conclusion that scholars did 100 years later. So maybe the opposite question is also worth pursuing. The fact that by using early photography, you could arrive at conclusions or the patterns that you cannot find by means of using the kind of documents and sources that people were using. As they said, literature, floor plans, surveys, and all that. In a way, what can photography add? You know, in the sense of producing a new vision, what kind of new parameters you can start to make. Yeah? So in a way, the opposite.
Well, what I think that photography really brought at that time was that even though it was monochrome, it revealed a fact. Even though, of course, every photography is a choice, every photograph is a choice. You choose the angle, you choose the setting, but I have tried to pick photographs that actually were less staged than the ones that are usually called orientalistic photos. Of course, they are a choice. They don't have people, most of them. That is a choice. They can be almost an anti-Oriental choice at a certain point. These streets are full of people. The streets are very lively. To have a street empty, it's not what the city is. Nevertheless, if we are looking at the morphological patterns of the city, it really helps. And we are a lot of architects here, and we all love to take pictures with our person sometimes, don't we? So, what I think that the camera at that time added was, first of all, to stop all the creation that an engraving or a painting created when seeing a city. Because the photo, the snapshot is there, so you cannot put that minaret differently. You cannot put the flag on it. You cannot make the stair more perfect, for instance. You cannot add, for instance, a flying veil on the streets flowing away. What photography stopped is descriptions that were really had a very pejorative sense in their meaning. That really wanted just to confirm the chaos, the insalubrity. They wouldn't look beyond that. And the snapshot, even though it has a lot of choices, at a certain point, it has like two filters, as far as I see it, and as far as it could be seen then, but it wasn't. It has the first one, it is a choice, but then it has the facts. From this picture on the left, I can see that the dome is ruined, and how the structure is there. Of course, I can interpret this there, a ruined culture. My God, look how they have the monuments. It's all disgrace, isn't it? But on the other side, if I was studying engineering, I could be studying this photograph. Whereas a description or a painting, maybe not. So that, I think it's the plus value that photography brought back then, which was not in the interest of the overcoming powers, European powers over the East, of course. They were not interested in putting these societies at the same level. They were not interested in saying, oh my God, they do have an order in the city, let's learn from that. Maybe we can start building next to them as they build. No, not at all. We shall build our quarters, we shall build our palaces, our gardens, far away from that. And in Morocco, that was very, very clear, by the way. So for me, that's the add value the photography has. And Roland Barthes also talks a lot about this and saying that, of course, the photograph can never lie, unless it fakes. But even when it fakes, it can never lie about the statement it is, about what it is depicted there. Even if I stage a scene of a 1001 Nights with veiled dancers, I can be staging something. But this, the tissue, the makeup, the hairdresser is there, and I can look deeper in that.
And then, well, yes, we started late, so please.
I can stay here for tomorrow already.
I had a question outside of the border or the frame that you depicted today, which is, and I think it could be a question that maybe helps to understand a little bit the context, and is about indigenous representations of the city. I wonder when in these cities citizens started using photography as a way to depict their own city and distribute those photographs. I wonder which medium was used to, to convey these regulations. You showed a section with a camel and a person on top of it. I wonder whether that was a Western reconstruction or whether that was actually a sketch used to enforce those rules and so forth. So I'm really interested to understand what is the other here, in a way that what could be the indigenous representation of the city, and whether these four categories of the upper landscape, closed landscape, the monument, and the domestic applies eventually also to those photographies or documents, or whether these local photographs went to Europe to study and come back and so forth. So I don't really know the context, and so it's an open question.
It's a huge question. And I'm going to stay within photography, otherwise we will definitely no dinner for more. There are very few, in these early stages, very few autonomous photographers. And the ones who started to develop their work, it was for two means. One, they saw there a market for tourists, and so they opened studios for that purpose, just like the foreigners ones. And others would be involved already in missions of recognition, for instance, of ancient ruins and stuff, in Iraq, for instance, which was independent earlier than the others. They never used to represent the cities with the means of photography, and photography never helped them understand their own cities. These rules that I tried to show, and that can be seen walking in the streets in a traditional Muslim city, or through these means, since we're very far away, photography, come mainly from the jurisprudence, and that is written. Okay, so that comes from the fiqh, that comes from the sharia, that comes from the sunnah. So everything has been like filtered by scholars more recently, and local scholars for that matter. Of course, because they dominate completely Arabic and sometimes other languages that have evolved as well, but mainly Arabic. And so they don't really represent the city. But there's one very funny thing. And that happened not only here, but also, for instance, in the Indian subcontinent. These photographs that depicted somehow decaying Oriental look of the cities were used after independences for nationalistic purposes. So as the photos of the monuments of our past, so those were the photographs that were available. And so they used For instance, you can see the Jama Masjid in New Delhi crumbling in a very Oriental perspective, and then that photograph used for, of course, Muslim nationalism within the Indian new country, etc., and etc., and etc. And Mughal, so Mughal, they go on and on. Minarets and mosques are the most common, of course, as you can imagine. But you know that Islam, in general, is not a culture that relies a lot on the illustrative. And so by that mean, as you can see in some details in some photos, decorative means are also very abstract, sometimes vegetalists, or sometimes using, of course, Quranic inscriptions. And so the representations of yourself, not the other, but yourself, is not really an exercise of that other.
I'll give you an example. It's still very difficult to take pictures publicly in Saudi Arabia. The police can even stop you and apprehend your camera. I never took pictures on the street in Saudi Arabia because it's still very complicated. And I'll give you another thing. For example, in Saudi Arabia you have a city called Medina Saleh. Medina Saleh is Petra on the Saudi Arabian side. It's completely abandoned. And only recently they allow tourism there because mostly it's Westerners that go there. We drive there and go in and out because they have a concept which is whatever is before the time of the Prophet is the Dark Ages for them. Is the barbarians. So they don't care about it. And like George says, figure representation is not something they like. I still had that. You couldn't photograph in the streets. It was very complicated. It was even complicated to get a photo for the visas. You had to ask them.